Welcome to Purdue University Extension's updating on the impact of the Indiana flood on agriculture. As almost everyone is aware, torrential rains throughout much of Indiana, especially over the last month, have either prevented planting of acres or flooded acres that have already been planted. And the purpose of today's briefing is really to just look at, from a lot of different aspects, to look at the impact of this flooding economically on agriculture. The way we will proceed is we have four speakers here at a panel, and those four speakers will share their expertise on some of the overall weather forecast, resolutions for farmers and opportunities that they have, as well as the economic impact. We will proceed after half an hour to a session where all the speakers will be available for interviews. And with that, I will turn things over to our first speaker. What's next in the weather forecast? Mr. Ken Sciringa with the Indiana State Climatology Office.
Thank you. Well, when it rains, it pours, doesn't it? Day after day, in the same places, over and over. Doesn't that seem like the pattern that we've had in June? Well, to think that perhaps it rains every day in June, you're probably not too far from the truth. Looking at our data that we've collected, I think there's only been 4 days this month where it has not rained somewhere in Indiana. So it definitely is a wet month with a lot of torrential rainfalls and damaging floods. I have a slide up there, if I can get that on the screen, on the left-hand side I've got a map of the Indiana rainfall in June so far, June 1st to 25th. And I think the thing that stands out right away is that big strip across the northern counties of Indiana that's in blue color. This is the area that's been the hardest hit in June. And in the blue color, I don't know if you can see the code there, but the blue color is for all areas that have had more than 9 inches of rain so far in June. In the dark blue color is areas that have had more than a foot of rain in June. Looking at some of the data, I did find some points in that area where the rainfall was as much as almost 16 inches of rain for the month of June so far. Well, what is normal for June? I guess we should compare to normal so we know where we stand. Normal for about this time in June is about 3.5 to 4 inches for the month. That's about an inch per week. We had some places in Indiana where we were getting 3 to 4, 5 inches a day. So I guess on the map you would try and find any color that's, the yellow color I guess would be the closest to anything that's normal or below normal, and there just really isn't anything on that map that seems to indicate there's any place that had normal or below normal rainfall, but that's not quite true. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, which is the U.S. Drought Monitor that came out on June 23rd, there are just a very few parts of Indiana where they're saying it's too dry. And that's true both for the Drought Monitor and for the USDA crop report. There's some areas, and now more so, let's say, along the Ohio River in the southeast Indiana, which are still saying it's just a little too dry. That's interesting because if we would expand that map out, though I don't have it up there, if we'd expand that map out to, say, Kentucky, they're crying for rain. It's been very dry down there, and there's an area, especially in southeastern Kentucky, where the drought is actually getting worse, and it is drought in that area. And that kind of brings up my next point is, how did we get here? How did we get all this rain in Indiana? And it's really a three-part story. We did not get all this rain in the whole state all at once. It came in sort of sections, I guess you would say, time periods, where the northern half of Indiana got hit the hardest, the first. There was a weather situation that went on for about a week. It's called a Bermuda High or Bermuda Block. And what this is a high pressure center off the coast of Florida that migrates westward toward the Smoky Mountains and pretty much just sits there for a week intensifies, spreads heat and humidity far into the inland. In fact, it went all the way into through Kentucky. It went that far. Well, it acts like a roadblock, which means that any storms that would normally go through south of Indiana were blocked. Their only choice was to go around this big roadblock, this big Bermuda High, and that path would have been through northern Indiana. And so every storm that approached Indiana from the west had to go through that same narrow corridor through northern Indiana. What that means is that area kept getting hit day after day after day with heavy rains. A lot of that moisture, which was intended for south of Indiana, ended up in northern Indiana, and of course in amounts much too great, that more than we could really handle. That lasted for about a week, in the second week of June, and then came the third week of June, when part two, I call it, came about, in which the remains of Tropical Storm Bill came up from the Louisiana area. Now this is where southern Indiana got its turn. For not nearly as long a time period, just a few days, but torrential rains hit southern Indiana. So this was their opportunity, I guess you would say, their turn to have heavy rainfall in that part of the state. And then there's part three, which is what we're in right now, actually, and continuing on. The current situation is we have a very fast jet stream that's going west to east across our northern tier of states, and that means across like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and that area. That is setting us up for a scenario where the warm, muggy air at the surface, along with that fast jet stream north of us, the atmosphere is just set up perfectly for more storms. So in the last few days, we've been getting more storms because of that part three scenario. So where does all this really lead us? Let's go to the next slide. Let's look at the forecast. Are we getting out of this pattern at all? Well, I got up there on my slides a 8 to 14 day outlook. I've got a month of July outlook. I could put up there also an outlook through September, but I'm finding out it really didn't make any difference which one I threw up there. They're pretty much all the same. They're calling for Indiana and the Midwest to have cooler than normal temperatures. That is different. But what's not different is there's still a very good chance for above normal rainfall. So we're not out of the woods yet. I guess my only hope is because we are in somewhat of a cooler scenario under this new forecast, I'm hoping that the rainfall amounts will be decreased, because usually your heavier amounts will be on the south side of the jet stream, and now we will be on the north side. So even though it is going to be wet come the next few weeks and through July and probably even longer than that, I'm hopeful that even though it will be above normal rainfall, that the amounts will be more reasonable. And that's sort of a snapshot of where we have been and where we are going on the weather, and that's where I'm going to stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. We will move on. We're very delighted this morning to have to be joined here by Julia Wickard, who is the Indiana State Director for the Farm Service Agency. And we'll let Julia bring us up to speed on some of the opportunities that FSA offers for producers that have been affected by the drought.
Thank you, Mike. Well, the year of the farmer. I think it holds true. We're here at the State Fairgrounds with the theme, and we certainly know our farmers across Indiana are experiencing some unprecedented rainfall and flooding issues, and I just want to share with you what FSA, the Farm Service Agency, the tools in our toolbox of how we can be of assistance as we move forward. The slide that will be up shortly will kind of identify the programs that are available to producers eventually as we move through this process. But we certainly know that these flood events have left some extensive damage and heartache behind. We have several disaster assistance programs, and particularly low-interest loan programs that can assist producers with recovery efforts. So I think the slide in front of you kind of will outline those, and I'll just walk through those quickly. The first process, though, that triggers everything is a secretarial disaster designation process. We have not yet filed for any kind of secretarial disaster designation in Indiana. Our county offices, 75 county offices across the state, are in that data collection mode, hearing from producers, from various stakeholders, in putting those kinds of numbers into our system. So the disaster designation process allows us to apply to the Secretary of Agriculture for a designation that could trigger additional resources in our programs that were part of the 2014 Farm Bill enactment back in February of 2014. The request for a secretarial disaster must be initiated within 3 months of the ending date of the disaster. And I think, as we heard, we're kind of still in that ongoing process. The additional trigger that must be met for a secretarial disaster is a 30% production loss countywide of at least one crop in the county must have been identified. When that secretarial request is made, FSA bases that production loss on several pieces of information. Certainly the natural disaster, and for this particular issue it would be flooding. The incident period, the time period of the disaster needs to be documented, and the specific counties that would need to be included in that designation. Ultimately, that secretarial designation starts at ground zero, starts at the local level. They certainly know best. And ultimately, the county emergency board, which is comprised of our state and federal agencies at the local level, those folks would convene, basically determine if there was enough documentation, statistical information, and then that is then elevated to our state office. Also, the state governor, individual farmers, local government officials can initiate that process, but all of those thresholds must be met as well. Our county offices at the local level, our Farm Service Agency offices, are completing those loss assessment reports that document where that loss is happening. So at this point, we do not have any counties that have come to our state office for disaster designation, but we know that process is in play in several counties in Indiana, and really the 30% threshold is the critical piece. If and when a secretarial disaster designation is made and approved by the Secretary of Agriculture, several other programs can be made available. We have emergency loans that are available through our farm loan programs, and those farmers in designated counties could be eligible for low interest loans. There is a production loss threshold that there must be at least a 30% loss, so that certainly holds true. For physical losses, if there's damage to property, there is no 30% loss requirement. All loans must be fully collateralized if and when that would happen. And the loan uses are pretty diverse in that they can be used to restore or replace essential property, cover production losses, refinance certain debts, or reorganize the farming operation. The additional piece that some of you may be interested in, as we now have a new safety net program that was initiated through the 2014 Farm Bill, is how the agricultural risk coverage or price loss coverage ARC PLC program might be impacted. Nothing is actually triggered for the ARC PLC program, but we certainly know that the impact of recent flooding on county yields and our national prices would impact 2015 ARC and PLC payments. So we're still farther down the road in making those decisions, but certainly that could impact yields and prices that could trigger payments for that new safety net program. The last piece I want to talk about is the prevented planning and a failed acreage component that our county offices statewide and nationwide, for that matter, monitor regularly. From a prevented planning standpoint, prevented planning requests must be received within 15 days of the final planning date for a crop. And yes, we're past those dates. June 5th was the final planning date for corn in Indiana. So June 22nd was the final date to file a timely prevented planning request to the Farm Service Agency. June 20th was the final planning date for soybeans. July 6th, however, will be that final date to timely submit a prevented planning request. So soybeans are still eligible for those prevented planning with no late file penalty. However, we do have the opportunity to accept late filed requests for prevented planning, provided that we have proof that a prevented planning claim was filed with a crop insurance agent. Otherwise, if they would file a late claim, it would be considered by our locally elected county committee at the local level on a case-by-case basis. Failed acreage, we certainly know there are pockets of the state where that has happened. And failed acreage credit must be filed at FSA before there's any disposition of the crop. So again, if farmers are in that scenario, encourage them to visit our county offices, let them know that immediately. And late filed requests for failed acreage credit will be accepted when proof is provided that that timely filed claim was provided to the crop insurance agent. So with all of this said, I think it's important to recognize that these programs are available if a secretarial disaster designation is enacted as part of the 2014 Farm Bill enactment. And when we look at our agency, our employees locally that work collaboratively with many of the extension folks in the room and across the state, as well as our partners with NRCS and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, we're ready to take on this challenge that probably will be confronting us as we move forward. And we look forward to being a resource and a partner locally. I would say we do have 4 fact sheets here that if anyone would like to receive those. We have a disaster designation process fact sheet. We have an emergency loan fact sheet, as well as our national office, because of other parts of the country that have experienced flooding, has developed a flood fact sheet. And then for those of you that may be interested and want to know a little bit more about our newest safety net program, the ARC PLC program, we do have a fact sheet for that. So with that, Mike, thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and look forward to hearing the rest of the speakers.
Thank you, Julia. Next, we will move on to some crop insurance highlights and some details that will be provided by Michael Langemeyer. Dr. Langemeyer is the Assistant Director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture in the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning. I want to cover at a fairly high level just some of the aspects related to crop insurance that are important to the current situation. So let me go. I've got a handout that covers the slides here, and so you don't need to be jotting this down. It is on the handout. What's not on the handout here that I want to talk about before I get to the information on the slides here is just some idea of how common crop insurance is in Indiana. Crop insurance is very common for corn and soybeans in Indiana and across the Corn Belt. In 2014, 81% of the acreage was insured with crop insurance. I'm sure it's similar in 2015. Soybeans, 83% of the acreage was insured. Again, it's probably very similar in 2015. Another thing I wanted to talk about before I got into crop insurance is our crop budgets did not look very good before the current situation. Even with trend yields, we were looking at negative margins. In fact, depending on where you were looking at in the state and what your trend yield was, margins were already a negative $50 to $100 per acre. That was before we saw any flooding and preventive planning and some of these kinds of things. And so in addition to crop insurance concerns here, I just wanted to point out that we're really concerned about financial stress. Financial stress was going to be on the uptick anyway. Even before we had this weather events, it's going to be even worse. And so that's a concern that we have, and that's a concern that we need to think about as we're moving forward with our decisions related to planting. On the slide here, Julia covered the final planting dates for corn and soybeans. They're listed there, June 5th and June 20th. There also, from a crop insurance standpoint, is something called late planting period. You can still plant during this period. However, coverage is reduced 1% per day for each of the 25 days in the late planting period. A very common policy, crop insurance policy in Indiana is a revenue protection policy. Typically, coverage levels are 75 to 85%. 1% per day is a lot. And so if you're planting 10 days late, you've reduced your coverage 10%. And so that's pretty important to keep in mind that we do have these late planting penalties, if you will. Next, I want to move on to a couple different scenarios just real quickly. A couple different scenarios here. The first one, options if the original crop has not been planted. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this option is actually less common than the second one, where the original crop has been planted and doesn't look very good, okay? But if your original crop has not been planted, the options are pretty straightforward here. Go ahead and plant the original crop, even though yields may be reduced substantially. This primarily plays into soybeans, of course. We're still in the late planting period for soybeans. Plant an alternative crop. I don't know how likely that is, but that's certainly an option. And then third, abandon the acres after final planting period. That's essentially your preventive planting. Typically in the Corn Belt, we don't have a lot of preventive planting acreage. That's typically much more common in the Great Plains, all the way from Texas to North Dakota. But certainly we're going to see some of that this year. But I think the more common scenario that farmers are looking at is they've planted the original crop. They may have planted it in early May even. Original crop has been planted, but now we have really concerns about the stand. There might be puddles out there where we have nothing. And so what do we do with this? What do we do with a crop like this? First of all, you have to remember from a crop insurance standpoint that we have crop insurance units. And so sometimes you may have a field that looks really bad, but that's only a fraction of your total crop insurance unit. Your crop insurance unit can be as large as your entire farm. And so you got to think about that when you're thinking about what to do with a specific field. How does this fit into the larger picture in terms of crop insurance? And having said that, when you're thinking about the considerations that I'm going to talk about here briefly, make sure you talk to your crop insurance provider when you're thinking about replanting, when you're thinking about abandoning the acreage, when you're thinking about leaving the damaged crop as is. Many times they can provide you some very helpful hints and make sure that you keep your crop insurance coverage. But basically, the four options we have, or the three options rather we have, if the original crop has been planted, leave the damaged crop as is. If there's a lot of damage out there, you will have some crop insurance coverage. Again, the agronomics is going to be very important to that consideration, and we've got some top-notch agronomists coming up here to talk to us about stands and talk to us about fertilizer needs and those kinds of things. The second option, replant the same crop. We're getting a little late for corn, but I think Bob's going to talk about replanting corn here, and so that could be an option if we have corn to replant the corn. Certainly from a soybean standpoint, you could also look at replanting soybeans. And the third option, plant an alternative crop. I'm not going to get into specifics here about these three options, but the main thing a producer needs to consider when he's looking at these three options, leaving the damaged crop, replanting the same crop, and planting an alternative crop, is to think about what is the additional cost I'm going to incur, for example, if I replant the same crop. What are my additional costs there? I have additional seed costs. Maybe I have to put on more fertilizer. Maybe there's chemical costs there. I certainly have planting costs. I have costs with soil preparation. So what are those additional costs? And compare that to the additional revenue. how much additional revenue am I going to get if I replant soybeans, for example? What are those soybeans going to yield? And again, the agronomics are extremely important to these considerations. And so those are the key thing. The key thing you need to think about from a conceptual framework is what are the additional costs and what are the additional revenue. And using that, I think you can decide between these three options. Of course, it's going to be different depending on the producer's situation. So with that, I think I'm going to leave it, and maybe we'll have some questions later on.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Michael. And next, we'll learn about the economic impact to agriculture of flooding. And for that, Dr. Chris Hurt from the Department of Agricultural Economics.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, and good morning to all of you. When we think about the economics, obviously there's the immediate thought that comes to our mind is how many of these acres have been flooded out, how many have been lost, and what's the impact on yield. But there are actually some other negatives and some maybe even positives for our agricultural sector around the state of Indiana that we can kind of outline. We're not going to be able to give you dollar amounts on all of these, but we can at least get started. And I think the other thing we have to say, as you've heard with the weather, as you've heard with Julia, we're just in the midst of this now. We don't know how much total damage there will be, but we do have some measures, at least how much damage we've had so far. So first, if you look at the visual, and we also have it on the handout, as we think about, the first thing we think about are reduced revenues, and that is things like we immediately think, well, what is the lost yield potential that's out there? How many lost acres are there? The USDA each Monday has a report called Crop Progress. Enumerators that work with USDA then rate the crop into 5 categories. And we generally think about the lowest of those, the very poor category, as probably land that maybe crop is totally lost. Now, that may not be totally lost. That's not the definition, but it's the worst category. And Indiana had 4% of their corn and bean acreage that were in the very poor category this last Monday report. 2% of the wheat was in that very poor category. So I think that's probably our best measure across the state as we have now. Many of our extension educators do also report as they travel their counties to USDA. And so I think that's kind of the best measure we have of how many acres could be lost. May not be all that 4% lost on corn and beans, maybe more like 3 to 4, but I think that's our best guess. Julia also mentioned up under reduced revenues, one of the possibilities we have is that as we have lower yield potential, could that influence prices? Lower yields, higher prices really affect revenues, and our new government farm program has the biggest participation program is a revenue program. And so that we're going to look at that in just a second to see what we think the impact is there. In terms of higher revenues, you say, well, how could producers do better? Well, we do have already the start of higher prices. So what we have is some compensation, lower yields as a state, but we also have some compensation in the form of higher prices. Of course, crop insurance indemnities could be quite important, what farmers collect. On the back side of that sheet of paper, we got a chart that has the dollars of indemnities that have been paid for, these are all crops. Corn and soybeans are our huge crops, but this includes all of our crops. And of course, the $1.4 billion with the 12 drought, you can see the enormity of that number. But if you take 12 out of that data, about $160 million across the state each year on average. Varies a lot from year to year. So I think, Michael, we're looking at higher amounts than normal. But again, that will have to be determined as we know these final losses. Higher cost, replacing nitrogen that's been lost, replanting cost. And there can be some lower costs, lower yields, lower handling costs. So to really do this economic evaluation, we're going to have to get more out to the end of summer and see what the losses are. But let's go to the table at the bottom of that sheet and look at what has changed just in the last couple of weeks. And we'll start out there with the rank of the crop. And so what we do is take these crop progress ratings and we kind of build those into an index, and then we look at how that has changed and how this year compares with previous years. So when I say that 2015 crop rank, if we go back to June 7th, before the really heavy Indiana rain started, first nationally, if we're looking at this in terms of how good is the crop, nationally we would have had corn rated at about 81st percentile. 100th percentile would have been the best crop in 100 years. This is the 81st best crop out of 100 years, or 8th out of 10th best crop. Nationally, by June 21st, 2 weeks later, the national crop was down to 61st percentile. Remember, totally normal would be 50th percentile. The national crop still rated as an above average crop. But look at Indiana for corn, we were 75th percentile. In other words, 7th or 8th best crop out of 10 years, so a very good crop start. And then in this last report last Monday, 35th percentile. So we went from a well above normal crop, a very good start, to a very discouraging well below normal. What are the impact on yields? We'd make some yield estimates. These can't be super accurate, but I think the changes at least give us a chance to talk about economic impacts. In the Indiana crop, we were talking about that crop ranked that strong, 178 bushels compared to about a 172 normal yield or average yield, dropping down to 168 bushels, 168.5 on this last crop report. It's almost a 10 bushel, 9.6 bushel anticipated drop in yield potential based upon those crop ratings. Now again, this is very iffy, and remember, it's the final crop ratings that are really highly correlated with yields, so a lot can still happen, but this was a very devastating period. If we work on down through that column on corn, that 9.6 bushels per acre at expected values, about $190 million of less grain that we have to sell on the corn side. And then I did calculate if we had 10% higher prices, that give $95 million received back. So a net of about $100 million impact on corn at this point. Over on soybeans, in the column to the right, 84th percentile crop, so a very, very good crop, 8 to 9 best crop out of 10 years, down to 44th percentile, so we dropped below average. That drops yields 52.8 to 50.7, or about 2 bushels per acre, and that's about $108 million. And in beans, not only do we have the yield losses, but across the country, particularly in Missouri, a lot of acres have not gotten planted, and we're anticipating about 2.5 million acres of soybeans will not get planted in the United States, and that's going to help prices come up more. We've got them 30 cents a bushel. Now, just looking at the value of lost production, we've got about $300 million. I think that's kind of a headline number at this point. That's basically here since the first week of June, dropped the value of our crop maybe around $300 million. There are some compensations. One of the negatives that we also think we have is government program payments. When you raise those prices, we're in a fairly sensitive area where, particularly on beans, raising prices some tends to lower the amount of government payments we would expect, and we've got a $60 million reduction so far in government payments across the state. So when we net some of these things out, maybe $200 million impact, but I think the loss of that crop in the $300 million range. Now, there will be some higher costs. We don't have those calculated here. Michael's talking about crop insurance. There's going to be some help. But I think as we come back, these are big numbers, that $300 million of lost crops so far. Our total crop production, or corn, soybeans, and wheat are major crops, with crop insurance normally is about $6.5 billion. So this is representing something between 4 and 5% of the value of this crop that has apparently been lost in the last 2.5 weeks. Now, let's also think these are big state numbers, and the impacts of this flooding and ponding and other wet weather are much more concentrated, as Ken mentioned. It's not the entire state. So when you start to think about the financial stress and then you start to bring these $200 to $300 million of impact down to a more limited number of counties and farms, there is really very major reasons for concern in those areas. Mike?
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. We'll take time for a couple of quick questions for this panel. A reminder that they will be back after we have some time for media interviews, but if there's a burning question or two right now, we could have time for that.
I couldn't quite hear.
Yes, sorry, we couldn't quite hear that.
The slide indicates a loss of the important estimated loss of the corn crop for bushels of 9.6%. That's all I have to do to say that the corn and soybean, the estimated loss of the
Yeah, again, we're just not, we've got a fan right up here running and we can't hear, but it was,
So he said the estimate on the sheet is 9.6%, but you said
those are bushels, 9.6 bushels, and that would be out of 172 bushel normal corn yield. So that that yield loss at this point, get the calculator out here, maybe, from a normal yield would be about 5%. About 5%. Those are bushels per acre, 9.6 bushels.
Another question? If not, we appreciate the speakers that we've had to this point. They will be back here for a panel discussion with more opportunities to ask questions in just a bit after our media interviews.